February 8, 1942. The forest around Demyansk lay buried under a thick, unbroken blanket of snow, each tree trunk frozen into silence, each branch weighed down with frost. A column of German soldiers moved forward, their boots crunching against a mix of ice and slush, leaving tracks that the wind soon erased. Their breaths hung in the air, curling in pale clouds like smoke from a distant, unseen fire, as if the cold itself were marking them for oblivion. To anyone watching from above, the soldiers might have seemed like ants, insignificant and endlessly busy, trudging through a landscape that cared nothing for human ambition. They had been sent to secure the small town of Demyansk, a minor outpost on the northern edge of a Soviet front, yet crucial to the German High Command's vision of encircling Leningrad. For the men, the expectation was clear: swift victory, minimal resistance, and a brief taste of winter's chill before spring thawed the land and their victories alike. What they found instead was encirclement. The Red Army's first shock army had slipped silently through the trees and frozen swamps, surrounding nearly 90,000 men in a pocket that promised discomfort, hunger, and death in equal measure. At first, it was subtle. Artillery shells began to fall at irregular intervals, far from precise, but each one a reminder that they were no longer masters of this land. Rations, once carefully distributed in neat tins, began to dwindle. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes, often before a man even noticed the pain. One private, Kurt Fischer, scrawled in his diary, "The snow is everywhere, up to our knees, in our mouths, even inside our boots." Some days I wonder if anyone back home imagines this. The officers tried to maintain order, their crisp voices cutting through the cold air, but their commands often carried the hollow echo of desperation. Major von Saldern, a stern man with eyes like flint, inspected the perimeter daily, trying to gauge the enemy's strength, but the forest refused to betray its secrets. The men began to rely on small acts of ingenuity: melting snow over a faint flame to create water, boiling horse meat when fresh food ran out, even gnawing at leather boots in moments of extreme hunger. The irony was never lost on them. They laughed quietly, wryly, at the absurdity of consuming what they had once scorned as mere equipment. The German High Command, far from the snow-choked forest, was already taking note. Reports to Berlin stressed the danger of the pocket, but framed it with bureaucratic optimism. Supplies could be flown in, reinforcements sent. The soldiers held fast until relief arrived. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe began to coordinate an aerial resupply, unaware of just how precarious the effort would be. The men on the ground watched the droning Ju-52 transport planes slice through gray clouds, knowing that each crate might mean the difference between survival and starvation. Yet even these flying lifelines carried a cruel randomness. Some crates fell neatly into waiting hands. Others were lost to frozen lakes, blown by wind, or struck by artillery before touching earth. Through it all, camaraderie persisted, fragile yet stubborn. Soldiers shared what little warmth they had: mittens, scarves, scraps of dried meat. They whispered about home, imagining spring fields and kitchens filled with warmth, small mental refuges from the frozen nightmare surrounding them. Lieutenant Weber, a man known for his quiet humor, tried to lighten the burden. He once quipped, as they huddled around a meager fire, "At least the snow keeps the rats from stealing our boots." It drew a rare, genuine laugh, a brief reprieve from the relentless cold. But laughter could not mask the growing realization: this was no ordinary setback. The encirclement was tightening. The Red Army strategy was methodical. Their artillery positions cut off movement, their reconnaissance infiltrated supply lines, and the psychological pressure mounted with each day. Hunger gnawed not only at the body, but at the mind. Letters from home seemed impossibly distant, their comforting words drowned by the wind howling through the trees. Survival became a negotiation between hope and pragmatism. Which fingers could be sacrificed to frost? Which meals could be skipped to save others? Which risks could be taken to retrieve a crate of desperately needed ammunition? And yet, in this grim calculus, the German soldiers learned a lesson that would echo through the war. They discovered resilience under fire, the fragile but stubborn capacity of men to endure when every element of nature and enemy strategy sought to destroy them. The snow that threatened to smother them also forged bonds, sharpened instincts, and taught the officers and men alike a bitter, ironic truth. Survival was not about victory. It was about endurance, about the small, persistent acts of human tenacity. By the end of the first week, the frost had begun to leave its permanent mark. Fingers were numb beyond feeling. Faces were weathered into masks of pale determination, and boots were reduced to soggy, useless shells. Major von Saldern walked among his men, observing the quiet heroism of ordinary soldiers. He knew that survival was possible, but victory was still uncertain, and the High Command's confidence seemed increasingly detached from the reality on the ground. In the distance, the Red Army's positions shimmered through the morning haze like a mirage, simultaneously tangible and unattainable. Each day brought a fresh trial. Rationed meals, the threat of attack, the relentless cold. Yet within this frozen trap, there flickered the stubborn ember of human resolve. The men endured not because they were assured of rescue, but because giving in was never an option. And as the weeks stretched into months, the siege would teach lessons far beyond the forest of Demyansk, lessons that the German command would carry blindly into the firestorm of Stalingrad, where endurance would meet its most devastating test. But even as the first air drops splintered against the icy ground and frostbitten hands grasped at meager supplies, no one could yet imagine the scale of the suffering still to come. The snow, the guns, the hunger, they were only the beginning. And in that realization, the men of Demyansk learned a quiet, ironical truth. Survival itself was the first victory, yet the war was far from over. The gray sky above Demyansk was a low, oppressive dome, pressing down on the snow-covered forest like a leaden lid. Ju-52 transport planes droned through the icy air, wings vibrating against gusts that could rip them from the sky. Each flight carried more than food and ammunition. It carried hope, fragile and flickering, for the encircled men below. And yet, hope was never simple. The pilots knew that a single miscalculation, a stray anti-aircraft shell, a sudden wind gust, could send a crate tumbling into a frozen swamp or shatter the fragile fuselage of their plane. Below, the soldiers waited with tense anticipation, eyes scanning the sky for the black silhouettes of approaching wings. Major von Saldern strode along the perimeter, his breath puffing in the cold air. His boots sank into snow already softened by a thin layer of thaw, each step a reminder of the difficult terrain that slowed even the fastest runner. He had learned to measure not just distance, but probability, the probability that a crate would land within reach, that a ration would last until the next delivery, that a man would wake the next morning. The first drops fell unevenly. Cases of ammunition crashed into snowdrifts, sending shards of wood and ice splintering in all directions. Bundles of food struck frozen ground with muffled thuds, scattering rice and canned meat in random patterns. Some soldiers scrambled to retrieve them, hands numb and stiff, teeth chattering as frost bit their lips. One private, Emil Kraus, dug a half-frozen crate from a drift and laughed through chattering teeth, a sound half relief, half disbelief. "If I die, I'll die with a full stomach of beans," he joked, a bitter grin tugging at his frostbitten face. The Luftwaffe pilots, many barely older than the youngest soldiers on the ground, navigated ice-coated instruments and brittle navigation charts. They flew low, skimming the treetops to avoid enemy fire, their eyes constantly shifting between horizon, altimeter, and compass. Oberleutnant Huber gripped the yoke, muscles taut, heart hammering, muttering under his breath. Every crate, every flight, it's all that keeps them alive, or kills us all. The irony was inescapable. Men flying metal birds through hell to feed men trapped in it. On the ground, the Red Army did not sit idle. Soviet artillery positions opened sporadically, shells screaming through the sky before burying themselves in snow or earth, shaking frozen limbs and rattling mines. Reconnaissance patrols probed the German perimeter, testing defenses with small attacks that drew fire, measured response, and kept the encircled men constantly alert. For the Germans, the siege was no longer simply a test of endurance. It had become a precise negotiation of survival, where every ration, every flight, every breath mattered. Within the frozen pocket, personal dramas played out with heightened intensity. Lieutenant Weber, still quietly sardonic despite frostbitten fingers, supervised a small team retrieving supplies. He watched Krauss pry open a case of canned meat, murmuring to himself, "If we survive this, the war will feel like a vacation." The words drew a faint chuckle, a rare spark of human warmth amid the relentless snow. Nearby, a medic worked feverishly to treat frostbite, melting snow over a makeshift stove, his hands shaking both from the cold and the weight of responsibility. Every touch, every administered bandage, was a small act of defiance against the indifferent winter and the omnipresent threat of death. Supplies remained insufficient. Though Luftwaffe calculations promised 265 tons daily, winter storms, lost crates, and Soviet interference made the actual intake unpredictable. Soldiers rationed food with grim discipline. A handful of rice, a few slices of horse meat, a piece of chocolate if it survived the drop. Blankets were scarce, gloves rarer still. Yet amidst the deprivation, morale flickered in tiny, stubborn ways. A shared cigarette, the whispered recounting of home, the joke cracked under frozen breath. Each became a lifeline, as essential as the supplies themselves. Even as endurance became routine, the siege reshaped thinking. Soldiers learned to adapt, improvising sleds to transport supplies, sharing boots and scarves, negotiating who would take the coldest watch. The forest became a classroom of survival, teaching lessons that no training could convey. Patience under fire, vigilance in the face of despair, and the quiet courage of ordinary men tested beyond imagination. Yet, beyond these daily struggles, a larger, more dangerous lesson was being absorbed. The temporary success of the airlift emboldened German command, feeding the dangerous notion that encircled forces could always be sustained from the sky. Stalin's forces, clever and relentless, could not fully annihilate the pocket, but they instilled exhaustion, anxiety, and the constant gnawing of fear. The soldiers of Demyansk endured, yes, but the cost of survival was etched into bones and hearts alike. As March crept forward, snow began to recede slightly, yet the siege remained unbroken. Each day, the planes droned through gray clouds, each thud of falling crates a note in a grim symphony of survival. The soldiers below, faces pale and eyes sharp with determination, counted each delivery as both gift and gamble. Hope was a fragile companion, and despair never far behind. Major von Saldern watched his men with quiet pride and cautious dread. He knew the siege had revealed strengths he hadn't imagined, but also dangerous weaknesses in German planning. Endurance alone would not win battles beyond Demyansk. Still, for now, survival mattered more than strategy. And even in the midst of frost, fear, and relentless pressure, the soldiers clung to life with stubborn intensity, unaware that the lessons learned here about overconfidence, reliance on technology, and underestimating the enemy would echo catastrophically at Stalingrad in the months to come. And so the pocket held, The forest silent, but for the hum of engines and the whisper of snow. The siege of Demyansk had entered a new phase, where hope and desperation flew together, wings of metal and wings of human endurance. The men below braced for what was next, knowing only that the frozen trap was far from over, and that the world beyond the snow had yet to reveal the full cost of this bitter, relentless lesson.